pleasure to welcome you to our inaugural event. For those of you who don't know about us, we are a nonpartisan student organization dedicated to bringing leading experts on the most important issues in science, politics, philosophy, culture, and more to speak and debate on the Berkeley campus. This afternoon, we have brought you a superbly qualified trio of panelists to discuss the most topical issue in American politics, the federal budget standoff between the Obama administration and congressional Republicans. As many of you know, the budget fight entered a new stage last Friday as automatic spending cuts known as sequestration kicked in, imposing billions of dollars of cuts to discretionary and defense spending programs. We hope that everyone will walk away from this event with a better understanding of Washington's fiscal showdown and different perspectives on how to resolve it. Now I will introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Professor Henry Brady. Professor Henry Brady is Dean of Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy. He has written on electoral politics and political participation, social welfare policy, political polling, and statistical methodology, and he has worked for the Federal Office of Management and Budget and other organizations in Washington, D.C. He is a former president of the American Political Science Association. Our second panelist. Our second panelist, Professor Lanhee Chen, is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and teaches in the public policy program at Stanford University. Before working at Hoover, Chen was the policy director for the Romney-Ryan campaign, as well as Romney's chief policy advisor, a senior strategist on the campaign, and the person responsible for developing the campaign's domestic and foreign policy. Our third panelist, Professor Robert Reich, is Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy here at UC Berkeley and was Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration. Time magazine named him one of the 10 most effective cabinet secretaries of the last century. He has written 13 books, is the editor of the American Prospect magazine, and chairman of Common Cause. And finally, I'd like to introduce Jason Willett from the Berkeley Forum's Moderating Committee, who will be moderating this afternoon's event. A little overview of how the afternoon will proceed. First, each of our panelists will give brief opening remarks to summarize their perspectives on the current fiscal gridlock and what they believe is the best way forward. Then they will participate in a 30-minute panel discussion. At the end, there should be around 15 minutes for questions from the audience.
So, my name is Henry Brady. I'm the Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy, but I'm also a political scientist. So I'm going to start by just giving some background as to how America got to where it is today, because I don't think you can understand the impasse that we face with respect to sequestration and all the other problems without understanding a bit about American politics. And I'm going to go back to the framers. And we got to start with the understanding and realization that America was started with a deep mistrust of government. That has to do partly with our revolutionary origin, concern about the kings of England, concern about the fact that people felt like they were getting persecuted by the government that was in place. We also started without a feudal system in place. We were an agrarian nation. Unlike Europe, we didn't have feudalism. And so those two facts really shaped America all the way up to the present day. So through the 19th century, our distrust of government meant that we continued through most of the century to have a weak government, with the moments like the Civil War where the government got a bit stronger, because Abraham Lincoln took powers to himself that he felt he needed to help solve problems, but then we would fall back to relatively weak, contentious, contending parties, and a government that really didn't get that much done. But also during the 19th century, corporations started to arise, and the whole fabric of American business changed in really fundamental ways. We were no longer an agrarian nation. We had large corporate structures. You can think of large corporate structures as being a little bit like feudalism. I mean, they're not really, actually, but they're like feudalism in the sense that they're big structures. They're powerful entities outside of government which can have a big impact on people's lives. And Americans did not quite know how to deal with corporations, partly because they hadn't had feudalism. So unlike Europe, where it was pretty clear how to think about corporations, and communist and labor movements developed, we didn't get quite that kind of thing. We got populist movements, a quite different kind of thing. And eventually we got progressive movements. Theodore Roosevelt, the New Nationalism. Woodrow Wilson, the New Freedom. And then in fact the amalgamation of those two movements that Wilson put in place by changing the nature of American society in fundamental ways with the establishment of the Federal Reserve, with the income tax, and Bob was just telling me actually the establishment of the Department of Labor 100 years ago. So those kinds of things changed the powers of American government, and then later, 20 years later, after we tried really unfettered laissez-faire capitalism during the 20s, and that seemed to abruptly fail with the Great Depression, FDR came along and said, well, we've got to have stronger government. That's the only way we can solve some of the problems of big corporations. And furthermore, we've probably got to have strong labor unions. So we get the National Labor Relations Act, and we get the establishment of ways in which unions can organize, and in which unions can therefore have countervailing power in corporations. And that was the American solution to the problem of big government. Instead of having really big government, we also had powerful labor unions. We did have some big government too to help on the social welfare side with things like the Social Security Act, which established Social Security, but also welfare and also unemployment insurance, all at the same time. So the next 50 years or so was really a story of Republicans essentially accepting the fact that we were going to have bigger government and that labor unions would be powerful. And so you go through the 50s with Dwight Eisenhower, then you go through Richard Nixon, through Jerry Ford, and even Ronald Reagan, although he made noises about not liking big government, and certainly did try to cut back on it somewhat, actually didn't do that much. Today, we have really a new landscape in which parts of the Republican Party, and maybe much of the Republican Party, is starting to ask the question of whether government is just simply too big. Whereas the Democratic Party is saying, no, government is the answer to a lot of the problems that we face. And I think that's the background in which you have to understand what's going on right now. A Republican Party which is very worried about the size of government, hearkening back to the Jeffersonian Republic in which people were worried about the size of government and wanted to restrict government. And the Democrats say, look, the New Deal happened, that was a solution to a lot of our problems. And furthermore, Democrats say, with the demise of labor, labor has gone from being something like 30% of the workforce to something like 15% of the workforce. With the demise of labor, we even have to have a stronger government to help protect the working class. That's where we are today. And on top of that, with the Civil Rights Movement and the South going Republican, we ended up with two very polarized parties. The rise of social issues through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Great polarization over those social issues. Also, a sorting of the American public and a sorting of politicians, so that whereas we used to have some liberal and moderate Republicans, Jacob Javits, Nelson Rockefeller, and we used to have conservative Democrats, from the South mostly, we no longer have that. We have a sorting of people into the two parties, conservatives in the Republican Party, liberals in the Democratic Party. And if you go to Congress, you find out whereas there used to be a lot of overlap between the two parties, there's no longer any overlap. They're completely separated. The most liberal Republican is more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. And as a result, this polarization means that in a system which was designed, by the way, to make it hard to get anything done, really doesn't get much done. And so one of the issues we face is, can American government at this point in time deal with the problems it has, given that the framers were worried about concentrations of power, made a government in which it was hard to get things done, but now we have a society in which there's tremendous polarization between the two parties so that they can't agree with one another. And is that going to really make it impossible to get anything important done in terms of governing? Because the parties don't agree, and the system certainly doesn't facilitate getting things done. And with that, I'll turn it over to my two compatriots who are going to solve all the problems for me.
We're making them worse.
Right.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and for the invitation. I'll say that I come here today with a bit of trepidation because I realize that I have two strikes against me. The first being that I'm a conservative Republican. And the second,
Not a problem.
and the second being, and the second being that I teach at Stanford, which that's the real problem. So you know, let me just start by saying that, you know, we just had this election, so you know, and you know, elections are about choices, and in elections, people get to choose between very different visions of where the country will go. And I lost. My side lost. And there are consequences to that. And ultimately, I think that what the election was about a vision for presidential leadership. Now, I think both Barack Obama and Mitt Romney are fine men, and they both do mean well for the country. Too often, that's not said. In America, you hear a lot of crazy vitriol coming from both sides, and it's not productive. But what I will say is when it comes to dealing with our fiscal impasse and the fiscal situation we face. And so as a result, they got a president for whom deficit reduction is a secondary issue. And I think that's part of the reason why you're seeing such difficulty in dealing with some of the fiscal issues that we face. And I think the sequester is a prime example of this. Now, for me, it's humorous that the word sequester has become a normal part of our lexicon in America. I mean, this is a really geeky you know, term that is generally reserved for people who work at CBO or OMB in Washington. But you know, now we've just had this cataclysmic event on Friday. And the result of that cataclysmic event has been, well, absolutely nothing so far. And I think that the reality is, and I've made this case in my own writing, and you know, I may be in the minority on this, but I don't think the sequester is actually such a bad thing. I think we have to disaggregate two issues with respect to the sequester, the automatic spending cuts. One is the manner in which the cuts take place. I think we all agree it's bad policy. We all agree that the idea of having an across-the-board cut that, as the president referred to as a meat cleaver, is a horrible thing. And so, hopefully, our leaders in Washington can figure out a way to address that part of it. But the other piece of it is the magnitude of the cuts. And here, I'm of the view that finally we have a mechanism in place to reduce spending. And it's not a whole lot of spending. It's about 2% of spending over the next 10 years, projected spending over the next 10 years, $85 billion in this fiscal year. The sequester finally does what politicians in Washington, Republicans and Democrats alike, were unwilling to do, and that's cut spending. And it's a tough thing to do. I understand that. I see the politics of it. I saw it from the campaign side. I saw it when I was part of the Bush administration. It's hard to cut spending because, you know, let's face it, everyone likes stuff. And when the government spends less, there's less stuff. And so this is a very difficult thing. Ultimately, though, I think the sequester is a microcosm of the environment we face today. An incredibly polarized leadership structure in Washington. The president doesn't trust the Republicans in Congress. I'm pretty sure the Republicans in Congress don't trust the president. I'm glad to see they're going to finally sit down for dinner next week. It seems like that's something that should happen a while ago, but they're going to do that. And so hopefully, you know, we'll fight our way through this, but ultimately we won't get through these fiscal challenges unless we do two things. And the first is focus on growth. Think about how we can grow our economy to get the revenue we need to get out of the fiscal impasse we're in. And the second thing is finally reform our entitlement structure. This is something that has had bipartisan support. We can discuss the details. We can talk about how we do that, but I think there has to be agreement that our entitlement programs are broken and that the promises our government is making today are promises that people in this room will not see kept unless we do something about the entitlement structure in this country. So hopefully we can come together and fix these two things. But you know, the sequester, it doesn't bode well for us. So hopefully we can see some change, and I'll look forward to that. So with that, I'll turn it to you, Secretary.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank the Berkeley Forum, and also thank Professor Chen for coming into the lion's den here. and I want to say, I do agree with several things that you just said, and I want to point out the agreements. But before I do that, let me just go back to some of Dean Brady's introduction. If the issue is posed as, do you want big government, or do you want government, or do you want smaller government, most Americans actually will say smaller government. We do not like government. Americans have never liked government. Even in the 30s and 40s, Some surveys showed that people in the abstract don't like government or powerful government. What we do like are the programs the government provides. We like Medicare, we like Social Security, we like investments in education and in infrastructure. We support safety nets. We think that most people should have an opportunity to get ahead, and particularly if they fall on hard times. So when it comes down to it, a lot of the divisiveness today, and we were talking about this a little bit just upstairs, or whatever, just up those stairs. A lot of the divisiveness today is peculiar in that the issues that are dividing us are not as powerful or as potent as the issues that divided us in the 60s. For example, the Vietnam War, civil rights movement, issues that really did strike at the heart of our notions of fairness and our notions of what we wanted our foreign policy and our domestic policy to be. No, today the issues that divide us on the sequester and on the budget deficit are hard for most Americans to actually understand, which is a bit of a paradox. If most people can't really understand them, what is it that's actually dividing us? If most people don't really like big government but like government programs, why are we so angry with each other? And I want to posit and hypothesize that one of the big things that's driving the degree of animosity today is the fact that most of us, that is, most Americans, have been working harder than ever if they have jobs. And if they don't have jobs, they are desperately scared. But even if they have jobs, they are working harder than ever and not getting ahead. The median wage today is 8% below, adjusted for inflation, what it was in 2000. Now, even though the Dow Jones Industrial Average scored a record yesterday, most Americans don't have a lot of money invested in the stock market. Their major investment, to the extent they have any investment at all, is their homes. And that investment is worth, right now, even though housing prices are beginning to come back, that investment is worth about 25% less than it was in the year 2007. So most people are frustrated and angry. The Tea Party movement, remember, came out of anger about the bailout of Wall Street. That was the origination of the Tea Party movement. That was also the origination of the Occupy Wall Street movement. They are remarkably close. They have different philosophies. The Tea Party movement is angry about government, or at least that's its focus of its energies and animosity, and the Occupy movement is angry with big corporations and Wall Street. That's the focus of the anger and animosity. But actually, if you interview a lot of the Tea Party people, or a lot of the Occupy people, or average middle-class Americans, and ask them what's gone wrong with the country, you get language like the dice are loaded. The system is rigged in favor of the wealthy and powerful. Government is colluding with big business and with Wall Street against the rest of us. Inequality of opportunity, of income, of wealth has not been as large in the United States since, by some measures, the 1920s, by some measures, the 1880s. And when you have that degree of widening inequality, again, of income and wealth and opportunity, there's a huge amount of frustration, potential anger, and there are plenty of people out there willing to take advantage of that frustration and anger and channel it toward whatever target of opportunity there may be. I think that's really where the divisiveness is coming. Now, to get to the budget, the federal budget. The budget deficit is an issue, but it is not a major problem. The deficit, as a proportion of the economy overall, is now about 5.3%. That is, the ratio of the budget deficit to the GDP is about 5.3%. That's roughly what it was when I came into the Clinton administration in 1993. It's not great, but it's not a crisis. We do have a budget deficit problem in about 10 years from now, projected out there, but that's almost entirely due to rising healthcare costs and the aging of the population. The two together, that is rising healthcare costs, which now are 18% of GDP, but about 10 years from now will be over 20% of GDP, combined with an elderly aging population is a recipe for economic problems. It's not just the federal budget deficit, it's not just Medicare, it's not just Medicaid, it's the whole society. 40 years ago, we had 5 workers for every retiree. Right now, there are 3.3 workers for every retiree. If the projections are correct, the direction we're going in, we're going to have, 20 years from now, 2 workers for every retiree. There's no way, given that demographic change, and also given the rise in healthcare costs, we're going to be able to afford it. That is the long-term budget deficit problem. It's not about current programs. It's not Social Security. I was a trustee of the Social Security Trust Fund, and I can tell you, with very modest changes, Social Security can be fine for the next 75 years. No, the real problem is Medicare and Medicaid, but the problem of Medicare and Medicaid, again, let me emphasize, is a problem of rising healthcare costs and an aging population, so it's not Medicare itself. Medicare itself is a very efficient insurance system. In fact, we'd do better, in my view, if we had a public option or Medicare for all or a single-payer system modeled on Medicare. Medicare is not the problem. The problem, again, is the underlying trend of healthcare costs rising that we have to get under control. And what do we do about the aging of the population? That's where immigration comes in. Immigration reform is closely, or should be thought of closely, allied with entitlement reform. You see, every rich country now is suffering from the same problem of an aging population. Where are there huge reservoirs of young people around the world? In developing countries. Every rich nation is going to have to face it over the next 20 or 30 years, that they're going to have more young immigrants to support an aging population. It's the only way you can afford it. Let me say one more thing, and then I'll stop, about the deficit. The sequester, I think, is very, very dangerous for 2 reasons. One, because half of it comes from domestic, non-military, discretionary spending. Who gets hurt when we cut back here? The people who are most hurt are people who are the most vulnerable in our society. Women, Infants, and Children program, the Head Start program, Title I of the education program for low-income schools. Almost all our low-income programs that are not entitlement programs are in this bin of domestic, non-military, discretionary spending, and are getting terribly hurt. Also, all of our major public investments in education, in job training, in infrastructure, in basic R&D, they are also being sacrificed. We're going to see Friday what the unemployment rate is, but we know that a lot of people are too discouraged even to look for work. When you have so many consumers holding back because they don't have enough money, holding back in the marketplace, and you have exports that are really not taking off. We're not a net exporter, and we're going to have even greater export problems because Europe is shrinking and contracting, and China is not doing nearly as well as it was doing. It's going to grow 7.5% this year, they project, not the old 8, 10, 12%. So even our not net exports, just our exports are not going to drive demand. Well, where is demand going to come from if government is also pulling back at the same time? This is the worst time for deficit reduction. We're going to have higher unemployment and slower economic growth. Where I very strongly agree with Professor Chen is that economic growth is a key to unraveling this problem. Because remember, the deficit or debt itself is not the issue. It's the ratio of the deficit or the debt to the GDP. If you get the ratio better, if you get the denominator growing, if you get the GDP growing enough and fast enough, then we get more tax revenues and the entire deficit and debt is smaller in proportion. So growth is critically important. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've been introduced. We've heard opening statements. I'm now going to ask some questions, but the panel should feel free to respond to one another. And please keep the responses brief because we don't have that much time and we have a lot of questions. So the first question is for Dean Brady, and it's late last year. Slate and YouGov did a poll where they asked respondents to sort through various government programs and find their own way to $900 billion in cuts. And the most popular measure was a tax increase on the rich, which we got in the fiscal cliff deal. The second most popular measures were cuts to military spending and cuts to discretionary government services. Cuts to Social Security and Medicare were the least popular. So my question is this. For all the complaints about the fiscal cliff deal and the sequester, is that not exactly the type of deficit reduction, or the only type of deficit reduction, that the American people would accept?
Well, it may be in those kinds of exercises. I think one of the problems we have right now is I fear that we're not doing a good job of explaining to people how important investments in the future are. And a lot of what's getting cut, it is certainly programs for the needy, but it's also, as Bob noted, all of these infrastructure items, by which I mean things like research and development, higher education, transportation infrastructure, and other kinds of things. And we're just desperate to invest in those kinds of things so we can have more growth. And so one of the tragedies of the current time is that we are cutting back on those kinds of things. I'm especially worried, obviously, since I'm here at Cal, we're a public university, we've already had tremendous cuts from the state. We're now facing the possibility that research and development, which we do very well in here at Berkeley, we have a lot of that kind of money, that's going to be dramatically decreased, and that's going to further constrain this university. And then, of course, there's things like Pell Grants and all the kinds of aid that students get that it's also going to be cut. This is cutting investments in America's future. Not rebuilding bridges is cutting investments in America's future. One of the great things Dwight Eisenhower did was create the interstate highway system, which meant that goods and services could flow more easily around this country. Well, that system is aging. That's from the late 50s. We've got to reinvest in all of those bridges and all of those roads, which are now deteriorating. So I think, unfortunately, although I understand what people, when you talk about discretionary spending, I don't think they understand the payoff that comes from a lot of that discretionary spending.
Professor Chen, so the Obama administration has put a chained CPI on the table, which is a reduction in the growth of Social Security benefits, and they put some Medicare means testing on the table. And Republicans, it seems, are unwilling to make a deal to avert the sequester unless the Obama administration drops all of its demands for any new revenue. And is that a fair bargaining position for them to make with the president right now?
Well, you know, look, I think that their point of view is that the last thing the economy needs now is more tax increases. Now, you know, part of this is that there were revenue increases as part of the fiscal cliff deal. And to now bring revenue into this discussion separately seems to be, as my colleagues up there said, moving the goalposts. And I think that that's a fair criticism. But ultimately, there are ways to deal with the entitlement crisis that have bipartisan support. You know, the notion of chain CPI, you know, I think that makes a lot of sense. Of course, that's going to hit some current retirees, which politically is difficult for our friends on Capitol Hill to do. I recognize the difficulty in that, but I think there's a lot of agreement about chain CPI. I think means testing, some form of means testing, I think there's some consensus that that's a good thing to do. But ultimately, you know, it'd be great to have some leadership on entitlement reform. And it'd be great to see some movement on entitlement reform. And I think that the unreasonable position is to say that entitlement reform wouldn't be part of the discussion. So I would fully expect that entitlement reform would be part of the discussion that we're having now. We have, you know, all of these.
Where would you go beyond the chain CPI and the means testing for Medicare?
Well, where I would go, President Obama wouldn't go, which is premium support. But you know, I think.
Well, short of that.
And I think, well, I think that you have to transform the system. I mean, I'm of the view that the system as it stands now, yes, we have a demographic challenge, that there is an unsustainable, that the current system is unsustainable. And so you have to move to fundamental reform that includes premium support. And again, we can have a discussion about what form that takes. I mean, this is not a crazy Republican idea. This is an idea that Alex Rivlin and Paul Ryan got together on a few years ago. I mean, it's a reasonable set of proposals to transform the Medicare program. On the Social Security side, the professor is absolutely right. There are some very minor tweaks relatively minor tweaks that we can make that will solve our 75-year problem with respect to Social Security. And so then it becomes a question of politics and political will. And unfortunately, if we're not even willing to change CPI, we're sure as heck not going to be willing to do some other stuff that would be considered more significant.
Does everybody know what change CPI is?
No.
Okay. There are those who argue that in fact we over-indexed for inflation in Medicare, so that means that Social Security, I'm sorry. Social Security. So that means that we have Social Security rising faster than the rate of inflation. And this gets into really technical arguments about what you think the right indicator should be for inflation and so forth. And there are those who say, well, actually, this is a good thing because this means that, in fact, we do over-index. That means that we help out folks who are in Social Security more and more as time goes on. But others who say, well, why should we be doing that when other people who have jobs, for example, aren't necessarily getting those kinds of increases at all, and therefore aren't even keeping up with inflation, much less being over-indexed with respect to inflation. And then this all interacts with the problem, of course, that things like healthcare costs, although they are covered in Medicare, but other kinds of costs are also things that fall heavily on the elderly. So that gets in the debate as well.
So Professor Reich, you said that now isn't the time for austerity because we have a weak economy, we have lots of people unemployed, but you agree that the 10, 20, 30-year budget projections look really scary. So can you say when exactly you would agree that it's time to tackle that problem, and how exactly you would do it besides single-payer healthcare?
I would say in March of 2021. No, maybe March 12th. Let me be clear about this. Social Security, I'm not a great fan of change CPI. I think because a lot of elderly people, they spend a disproportionate amount of their income on healthcare costs. Healthcare costs are rising much faster than inflation, and so you're basically hitting them with a double whammy. And I would much rather deal with Social Security by raising the ceiling on percentage of income subjected to payroll taxes. Right now it's $113,600. Above that, you don't pay a dime of Social Security.
Extra.
Extra.
You are paying on the first $113,000.
You're paying on the first $113,000, $113,600. So Bill Gates fulfills his Social Security obligations for the year at about 12 minutes past midnight, January 1st. I mean, it's, it's in terms of the pay-ins into Social Security, it's a very regressive system right now, and I try to make it somewhat more progressive by lifting that ceiling on the percentage of your income subjected to Social Security. With regard to Medicare, I would tackle healthcare costs. In other words, I would say the issue is not Medicare. If I didn't make myself clear in my initial statement, I'm going to make it as clear as I can now. The issue is that we have an incredibly wasteful healthcare system. The administrative costs have been estimated to be anywhere from 20 to 35% of every healthcare dollar just goes to administration. We're the only healthcare system in the world where private insurers basically are trying to avoid sick people.
Professor Reich, can I just push you on that for a second? So that sounds good to negotiate the cost down, but can you say exactly how that would be done?
Yeah, we would have, and we're already beginning to do this. They're called accountable care organizations. In the Affordable Care Act, there are a lot of incentives for states, particularly through the insurance exchanges that are being set up, to in turn encourage the formation of accountable care organizations. They get paid not so much for fee for services, but they get paid for healthy outcomes. So there's a much greater incentive to provide preventive care. I mean, my father began, a good example of preventive care. My father began walking 2 miles a day when he turned 80 years old. And 2 weeks ago, he celebrated his 99th birthday. Wow. And we have no idea what he had. So there are various ways we know, and other countries have done it. And I think that the Accountable Care Act is one way of doing it, but again, the administrative costs can be lowered even further You want to move away from fee-for-service, but you also want to get administrative costs down, and that's where I think a public option or a single payer is really quite important. Now again, it's going to be very hard to sell that. It's hard enough to get Affordable Care Act. With regard to other aspects of the budget, I want to make more room for the kind of investments that Dean Brady is talking about. Education and infrastructure and basic R&D. The way we make more room for those things is to close tax loopholes, such as the carried interest rule, which allows private equity managers and some hedge fund managers to treat their income as capital gains. Now at about 20% tax rate rather than an ordinary income. Or why should you have a home equity mortgage interest deduction when you have a mansion and you're paying $100,000 a year in mortgage interest? Why should that be deductible? Shouldn't there be a limit on how much you can deduct with regard to your mortgage interest? Some of you, your eyes are glazing over. But there are a lot of things that can be done in terms of closing loopholes. I would shrink the military. I think the military is one of the places where we have the most bloat, and that's where I'm least concerned about sequester, quite frankly. I would also end what has commonly been talked about as corporate welfare. We have so much tax expenditure and so much subsidy going to particular industries and particular companies because they happen to have a lot of lobbyists in Washington. And there's no reason for them. They don't serve the public interest. I would certainly get rid of them. But all of these, I would say, should be designed to increase the amount of room we have for the public investments we need to grow the economy and create broader opportunity for the future, not simply to reduce the budget deficit.
Professor Brady, 2014 and 2016 are obviously on everyone's minds as we watch this, and most polls show that Republicans are very unpopular, and a plurality of Americans blame Republicans for what's going on. So if Republicans keep stonewalling, or if voters at least perceive them to be stonewalling, can we expect them to just be thrown out of the House in 2014?
Well, I think that would take a lot for that to happen for a variety of reasons having to do with the shape of districts in the various states and also just the lead that they currently have in the House. And also, to be honest, I'm not convinced right now that Obama is getting the best of the Republicans in this particular go-around. I think people are starting to just get frustrated with both sides, really, really frustrated. And pox in both of their houses is the feeling people have. I'm worried that Bob talks about, it is true right now that we start finding that the rate of healthcare cost increase has gone down. Everybody got that? In other words, it used to be going up like that, and now it's going up like that. Okay, so that's good, and that means the rate of healthcare increase has come down, but it doesn't certainly mean that we're not going to still grow the healthcare sector from 18% to something like 20% or whatever. So the question is whether or not Obama's legislation, healthcare legislation, has enough in it. I mean, there is indication that in fact, and it's a surprise to some of us because we didn't think there was much in that legislation that would control healthcare costs. There is an indication that in fact some of the things like the accountable care things that Bob was talking about actually have had an impact. So that's a surprise. But is that enough? And I'd actually like to ask you if you think that's enough. You're talking about premium care, but is there anything short of that? I mean, I think we want to think about something like co-pays or some kinds of ways that people have skin in the game, because it's certainly administrative costs are a scandal in this country. But it's also the case that people essentially feel like they're not paying for their health care and they want all the tests they can possibly get.
Yeah, there's no real consumer dynamic in healthcare in the United States. It's not like you go and get an MRI and you know how much that really costs. I mean, you know what you pay for it, and usually it's, if you have a private health insurance plan, you're going to pay some kind of copay plus a percentage of the cost. But you don't really know how much it costs. You don't, I mean, you may see the bill, a lot of people get these things called explanation of benefits in the mail and they toss them out, right? They don't really take a look and see how much they're being charged for things. And so I think that ultimately what it will take to control healthcare costs in the long run is a greater consumer dynamic. And it's the same kind of dynamic we've seen over and over again in the American economy. And until we have more of that transparency on price and quality, and you know, some of that we've seen over the last few years. There have been various pieces of legislation. There was some of this in Obamacare as well that sort of promotes a greater understanding of what you're actually paying for and what you're getting for what you're paying for. I think that that is really an important part of the healthcare system. The other thing I'll say is that, you know, I'm of the view that we have to do something about the way healthcare is treated in the tax code. So we have this asinine system. I mean, it wasn't asinine when it was created, it's asinine now. The system where if you buy health insurance, by and large, through an employer, you get a tax break. But if you buy it on your own, you don't get that same tax benefit. There are some cases where you buy it on your own when you do, but those are relatively limited. And so as a result, people end up signing up for jobs and staying in jobs longer than they probably would otherwise. They end up kind of selecting healthcare plans that are pre-selected by their employer. And there's a debate about whether that's a good or a bad thing. You know, a lot of people think maybe that's a good thing because I really don't want to be out there on my own making choices in healthcare. But ultimately, unless you get to a system where people can take health insurance with them from job to job and have the ability to really select from the full array of what's available, you're not going to get that consumer dynamic working that I think is ultimately what's necessary to bring costs down in the long run. The answer surely isn't rationing. And you know, I think that's something, at least amongst people that I hang out with, I guess is probably the best way to describe it, is pretty well established. Maybe I need to start hanging out with other kinds of people. I mean,
They would like to.
But you know, I think in the long run, that consumer dynamic is going to be the most important part of driving healthcare costs down.
Can I just ask you one question, by the way? You worked with the Romney campaign. Is Obamacare really Romney care and vice versa? We're just friends here.
Well, you know, I think that the thing that people forget is that the individual mandate was a conservative policy, right? It was originated by conservative health policy scholars in the 1980s. And the reason why is because it relies on individual responsibility. We have state insurance regulators that determine what has to, we have state regulators and state legislators that determine what has to go into healthcare plans in various states. And there are a lot of differences between the states. And so when you have a plan at the state level versus the federal level, there are actually differences. So I think they are conceptually distinct, but I understand why. I understand why.
Thank you.
Can I just a point, 2 points. One is most Americans today get their health insurance through their employers. When they are given employment, they make a choice, a consumer-type choice, between 3 or 4 or 5 plans. And that kind of consumer choice makes a lot of sense. And hopefully we will get to a point where all Americans have that kind of choice. But when you get to specific choices, it becomes absurd. Yesterday, I went to my doctor. I fell in the shower a week ago. I have a little kind of a problem in my hip. And he said, well, we need an x-ray. The idea that at that point, when he says we need an x-ray, I'm going to say to him, how much is it going to cost? And do we really need an x-ray? Because can't we do an MRI? Or maybe we could do, and I can come up with a list of other alternatives. I'm not going to have that conversation with my doctor. Consumers can't have those kinds of conversations with their doctors because consumers don't know enough to have those kinds of conversations. Consumer choice makes a lot of sense at the macro level in terms of choosing plans, at the micro level of deciding what tests to actually take and what kinds of therapies and what kind of drugs. It makes almost no choice at all because we are so ignorant and so vulnerable at that particular point. But more importantly, a macro point right now. You notice we started talking about the budget deficit, and we're now talking about healthcare. Do you understand why we are now talking about healthcare? Because that is the key issue underlying the long-term budget deficit. And yet, ironically, with regard to the sequester, there is no discussion going on in Washington whatsoever about the future of healthcare costs right now.
The next question is sort of a non-traditional question, and it's for Professor Reich and Professor Chen. I want Professor Reich to do his best in 1 minute to summarize the Republican position on the budget right now. And I want Professor Chen to do his best in 1 minute to summarize the Democrat position.
shakes his
I want to discuss, and I want you each to evaluate how well each of you did.
Okay, on the Republican side, there really are two contrary Republican positions, and this is why it's very difficult for Republicans to come together. One position says, we really don't want to get the budget deficit down so much as we want to reduce the size of government. That's why we are not going to go for any tax increases. I mean, we're not going to close any loopholes. I mean, our real goal here is simply to reduce the government size. That's what we care about. Everything else is a smokescreen for getting the government to be a smaller government. We have an ideological preference for a smaller government. We think the government is too big, etc., blah, 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 blah. Now, there is a different group of Republicans, and some Democrats as well, have said we have a huge deficit problem. The deficit, if you look at the debt is over 70% of GDP. We're paying more and more interest to foreigners. If we don't get some control over this, it's already getting completely out of control, and it's going to get even more out of control. And by the way, the easiest metaphor for people to use and understand with regard to the budget deficit is a family. A family takes care of their budget, and so if they go deeper and deeper into debt, eventually they are going to run out of money. Same thing with the federal government. By the way, that's wrong.
Can I just add one thing? Many of you may have said, gee, I think Professor Reich just contradicted himself, because earlier didn't he say that the deficit was like 5% of the GDP, and now he's saying the debt is over 70% of the GDP. It's important to know the deficit is the year-by-year difference between revenues and expenditures, and the debt is the accumulated deficits over time. And so those are two different things. So what he said was in fact perfectly consistent and correct.
Thank you, Mr. Dean.
Well, I think ultimately what the Democrats are seeking is what they describe as a balanced approach, and that I actually think the president does a brilliant job talking about the position that he has, because who doesn't want a balanced approach? It sounds great, and so that includes a mixture of some spending reductions in some areas with additional revenue that comes from tax increases primarily on the wealthy. And, I think within the Democratic Party there is also a slight disagreement over, whether there should be any spending reductions at all. I think that the traditional sort of blue dog Democrat, Southern, sort of more conservative, fiscally conservative wing of the party, if you will, makes some concessions on the need for spending reductions in certain areas. And there are others that don't see spending reductions as being a priority right now. And so, ultimately, it's a question of what mixture of revenue increases and spending reductions we need to solve our deficit problem.
Last question from the panelists before we get to a couple questions from the audience, hopefully. Brady, is there going to be a grand bargain by 2014?
Oh, by 2014?
Or by 2016, by the end of President Obama's second term?
No, I think we're going to do this piece by piece, little piece by little piece by little piece. Maybe it'll accumulate to look like something like a grand bargain, although I don't even think that's true. The Congress works best by just doing little deals where in fact, sometimes stupid little deals, like we see with sequestration, and that's how they're going to continue to do it. So unfortunately, we're going to have this Perils of Pauline continuing month by month for the next few years. And that's one reason I'm getting frustrated with it. I'm a political junkie, to be honest. Now I'm tired of it all.
Yeah, I don't think we'll see a grand bargain anytime soon. I do think there are some big issues that we will hopefully get to this year. I think we will get to immigration reform. I don't know if we'll pass immigration reform, but we'll get to immigration reform. We'll have a conversation, as the president likes to say, about immigration reform. I actually think that there's some momentum for tax reform, and I think what Professor Reich talked about, makes a lot, particularly on the corporate side. The Super Committee actually came to an agreement on corporate tax reform that involved lowering the corporate tax rate from 35% to, I think it was in the low 30s, high 20s, getting rid of a lot of that underbrush that could be constituted as corporate welfare, and making the American corporate tax code more competitive with tax codes around the world to help our businesses grow and invest. And so I think you've already seen that agreement on the corporate tax side. I think we'll probably see some action on corporate tax this year. On the individual tax side, it's a little bit trickier, but at the very least there is an effort underway on the House side. The House Ways and Means Committee, led by Dave Camp of Michigan, has started to put together some of these working groups on a variety of different issues with the goal of having some kind of comprehensive tax reform proposal by late summer. And so, the momentum's there, so I'm hopeful we'll do something on tax reform. But in terms of a big bargain a la Bull Simpson, no, I don't think it's happening.
Great. We now have 5 or so minutes left before we need to leave the room, and we'd like to get to a couple questions from the audience.
I'm not saying that China is a rival, perhaps economically, to America, and we said that we need to develop infrastructure. I think Professor Reich mentioned that infrastructural development is a step that America needs to take, and I'm in agreement with that. And like Chinese companies are exporting their infrastructural developments to developing nations in Africa, and they're sending settlers to Africa as well to buy up land, ostensibly to send the profits back to China. Would it be advantageous for America to sort of adopt this type of foreign policy that China is currently,
Right.
Yeah.
We don't have the capital right now to be doing that kind of thing. The reason China can do that is it's got an enormous amount of capital because of the fact that it has been so good with respect to trade. And so it's accumulated enormous amounts of capital. So now it can use that capital to invest in other places. They also are extremely worried about having resources in the future, so that's one reason they're doing that, to make sure they have it. I'm not sure America needs to do that, especially with fracking coming along and natural gas being more and more available, even in the area where we've always been very vulnerable, that is to say, gas and petroleum. We're looking much better.
We can't do that also because we don't know who we is. And China has a national industrial policy. It has Chinese companies, Chinese banks. Chinese has a strategy for building the future of China using foreign trade and foreign direct investment as means of building China's economic might. The United States has global companies headquartered in the United States whose primary goal in life is to maximize their profits. Wherever they can maximize their profits, they keep a lot of the profits abroad, they hire people all over the world, they make investments all over the world. They really don't care, and I'm not criticizing them, this is the way global capitalism is working under the American model. They don't care about the U.S. economy, only to the extent that it has an effect on the bottom line.
Other questions? There's a person.
Okay, why not a flat tax?
Who wants it?
I'll take it, but I would also very much like to hear Professor Chen's response. Adam Smith talked about the importance of a progressive tax that was not just the same percentage of everybody's income, but was actually a higher percentage for higher income people. Why? Because in his calculus, this is Adam Smith, 18th century, in his calculus, the real point was equal pain. And that to get equal pain or equal sacrifice, a very wealthy person had to provide more than the same percentage than a very poor person. Hence, a flat tax violates that fundamental principle of progressivity, equal pain, equal sacrifice.
Professor Chen, would you support a flat tax?
I wouldn't. My sense is that I have some practical concerns. I think it's really hard to make the numbers work, frankly, in a flat tax system. We studied a number of them during the Romney campaign and ultimately came to the conclusion with respect to adopting a flat tax that it'd be very difficult for us to keep all of our commitments and put in place that kind of a system. I think that the notion of a progressive income tax is one that's pretty well accepted across the political spectrum. And so in that sense, I agree with the notion that I'm not sure a flat tax is in keeping with that.
Professor Chen, you mentioned that the sequester doesn't really bother you in the scope of what it is, about 2%. And Dean Brady, you mentioned that Congress does things when it takes small student steps. In line with that, if, you know, going through with sequestration, there will be some impact as far as jobs lost, maybe not as much as the Obama administration says, maybe not as little as the Republicans want you to believe either, but you will lose some jobs, there will be more people out of work, less people paying paying taxes or providing revenue for the government, in which sense the sequestration could be quite counterproductive. So along that line, would you agree that it's probably a better idea right now to focus simply on creating jobs through stimulus, building roads, investing in R&D, giving money for higher education in that sense, and, you know, stimulating the private economy as well, and then focusing on issues such as the deficit and the debt in the long run, where we're not in such a rut, when we don't have 7 and 8% unemployment in the country?
Let me make 2 points. The first point is that I think the challenge with the sequester, and you know, I think that there is some agreement out there that there are some short-term effects with respect to employment. But what are the long-term impacts of a regime where sequestration doesn't happen? That's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about the long-run consequences of fiscal irresponsibility on our ability to create jobs and grow the economy. And so in that sense, I would gladly take the short-term trade-off if it meant in the long run our economy would be healthier, growing, and creating more jobs. That's the first point I'll make about that. That addresses the short-term question. You know, and I think the second issue is we had a stimulus. You know, we had a very large stimulus, and I'm not convinced that it worked.
I am. I think it worked, and it worked quite remarkably well. And more of it working better.
I'm not convinced it worked. and so you know, it's great to talk about investments in infrastructure, and I think our country needs to do more of that. But infrastructure is not it's not a good way to create jobs in the short run. I don't think. And so that's kind of why I would not take a sort of stimulus approach again.
It seems to me, within the context of my 33 years, that there's never been a time where there's been such a disconnect between what Americans want and what's being talked about in DC and what's being put forth in terms of legislation. I'm curious, A, if you agree, and B, if there's comparable time where we've gotten out of this strange situation where we're not being represented in DC.
The late 60s were a pretty alienating period in terms of what was going on in Washington, D.C. and what people were thinking about in localities and so forth. So I'm not sure that's true. I think it's a frustrating time, partly because of what Professor Reich said, which is that these are not that remarkably big issues. I mean, when has it gotten to the point where taxes are somehow evil, and so we can't increase taxes a little bit? And when is it that spending cuts are evil too, and we can't have some of them? And so why can't we get a deal here? That's what's so frustrating about it. But I think we've had periods of American history where there was a greater disconnect between what was happening in Washington and what was the feelings of the general population.
The biggest disconnect I see is in framing the overall central economic issue. It is not the budget deficit now. It should not be now. Most Americans understand that it's not the budget deficit. It's jobs, it's wages, it's widening inequality. Most Americans get it. Most Democrats, when they're running for office, as they did not that long ago, last November, also got it. Why, in the interim, we have now found ourselves back in a frame of reference in which the major issue is how do we reduce the budget deficit, it seems to me, a fundamental failure of leadership on the part of the President and Democrats in Congress.
And Professor Chen, because you came here with 2 strikes against you, I'll let you have the last one.
But, you know, there is a lot of vitriol, as we were discussing earlier, and that's one thing that really struck me, you know, being on the campaign trail with Mitt for the last year and a half, was how often I would encounter people with very deeply held beliefs on either side. And sometimes, you know, those beliefs were deeply held for a reason, but a lot of times they weren't. There's just a, I don't like Obama because I don't like Obama. Or I don't like Republicans because I don't like Republicans. And it's very difficult in that environment to imagine there being agreement on even the small stuff. And so, I don't know what it's going to take. I would say that it's going to take a Nixon to China moment on the part of either the Republicans in Congress or the President to get there. But I don't know if there's the courage on either side to do that. And so that's kind of why we're stuck where we're stuck, and it's unfortunate.
And that's all we have time
I
for.
just, before we recess, I really want to thank Professor Chen for coming.